This past Friday, I began a study of Galatians with the senior adult group that I lead every other week. The group's called Walking with Wisdom. Maybe I've talked about it before. Maybe you've even seen something about it on Facebook. Well, when you're talking about Galatians, you really can't introduce the letter without mention of the whole circumcision thing. I mean, it's just there. A woman in the group who's been teaching children's Sunday school for over 40 years noted that she had never come up with an explanation for the practice, at least that was suitable for inquiring minds of 9 and 10-year-olds. You know, I've never really thought of that, but how do you teach? How do you talk about the subject? Now, of course, circumcision today is a medical procedure. It's usually done on infant boys when they're a day or two old. It's not something that they're going to remember. That's a good thing. But not in the Galatian letter. When you're in Galatians, you are talking about adult males, though especially Gentiles who are being converted to Christianity. The Judaizers were insisting upon this, as you know, and we'll say more about that. Well, I asked the women in the group if they noted the overwhelmingly male perspective in the book of Galatians. They said they absolutely do. And then I asked them if they were glad that this first century form of, I guess you could call it bathroom surgery, if they were glad that it pertained only to men. And I got a hearty yes to both of those statements. Now, I tell you this because probably we would get a similar response from men regarding verse 19 of our text. Did you see it a minute ago? Paul says, I am again suffering labor pains for you. I'm guessing that there's not a man anywhere who would want to experience pregnancy, labor pains, and childbirth. Now, I know I wouldn't. I'm happy to just hear it described, you know. But Paul uses some really, metaphorically at least, he uses the imagery of labor pains and childbirth in a very odd kind of way. We're going to look at that this morning. And just so you know, this morning we are taking something of a breather with a text that doesn't require a lot of mental heavy lifting to understand and to appreciate. In this text, we get a chance to feel Paul's heartbeat. Paul speaks from his heart. He shares what is his greatest desire for those to whom he ministers. And I submit to you that the sentiment that he shares is something that ought to characterize all pastors, teachers, churches, and all of us, really. Well, we'll get to that in just a few moments. Now, as we begin, I want you to look at the verse immediately preceding the text that we read just a moment ago. Look at verse 11, if you will. And looks like a long time ago I underlined this, and I'll tell you why here in a minute. Listen to what Paul says in verse 11. He says, I am fearful for you that perhaps my labor for you has been wasted. Now think about that for a minute. The reason I have that underlined, I wrote in the column here, it is a pastor's greatest fear. it expresses a fear that I would say is common among all pastors who are especially conscientious in their work. Sometimes pastors indeed get the impression that their time and effort are being or have been wasted in helping others come to faith and to grow in discipleship. It's a time of frustration. And while I wouldn't say that Paul is quite ready to run up the white flag with these Galatians, at the same time, I think the thought had entered his mind. I think he had wondered if redirecting these misguided people of Galatia was ever going to happen. And so here, as Paul continues to write this letter, seeking to straighten out a misconception, that misconception being that in order to become a Christian, and he's addressing Gentiles here primarily, in order to become a Christian, you first had to become a child of Abraham, and you did that through the rite of circumcision. And once you were a child of Abraham, or you were of the seed of Abraham, then indeed you could become a Christian. And so Paul is railing against this idea that salvation is a grace plus kind of proposition. And as you know, if you've read some of these previous texts, or if you've heard me preach from these previous texts, it is something that has him extremely riled up. Now, let's think about it for a moment. Paul, his state of mind here is revealed in verse 11, and what we have in what we read a moment ago is an approach now that's going to be different in tone from what we've seen up to this point. You'll notice that in our reading today, Paul's harsh rhetoric has softened. You'll notice that his anger seems to have abated as he entreats these people to recall better days that they had together. I call it a come let us reason kind of tone. And while I think that it was certainly a tactical approach in that, Paul, if anger wasn't going to get the job done, then maybe a peaceful, loving entreaty would get things done. But I also think that it wasn't just a tactic on Paul's part. It gives me reason to think that Paul was capable, or ready at least, to adopt a better understanding of what his opponent's motives were. Think about these things just for a moment. Now, in the larger scheme of the New Testament, people like the Judaizers, people like the Pharisees, and a few other groups I would name a group called the Gnostics, but primarily the Pharisees and the Jewish religious establishment, they are everyone's whipping boys. If it's the Gospels or if it's in the letters of Paul, they get beat up on quite a bit. But when you consider the religious background of Jewish converts to Christianity, now I'm talking about these people who are inclined to listen to this reasoning about becoming, the importance of circumcision and such, it's not surprising that these Jewish folks wanted to retain certain critically important elements of their faith. And if others, if outsiders, quote unquote, were going to be a part of the faith, then they thought, well, they need to come along with us. The scriptures that these people looked to, our Old Testament, told them in Genesis chapter 17. You might want to jot down this reference because you might want to look at it later on. In Genesis chapter 17, verses 10 to 14, it says very plainly that those who are of the seed of Abraham were to be circumcised. It says that in a very plain way. It also says that those who are uncircumcised are to be excluded from the people, even though they were Hebrew by birth. If they weren't willing to go along with this particular rite, then they were to become outsiders themselves. Now, no less than the Apostle Peter and James, the brother of Jesus, who was the leader of the Jerusalem church, both of these guys had strong Jewish leanings, as you may recall. Peter and James were fairly conservative in their outlook about who could and who might not be a candidate for Christianity. Now, Peter's mind was changed to his credit. You know, Peter came along after his experience at Joppa and says, I've come to the realization that God is no respecter of persons. Maybe you remember that. But you can see how easily it might have been for the Jewish element in early Christianity to raise questions about Paul's approach to the faith, which in their minds may have seemed biased against Jewish practice. Maybe this helps. Maybe Paul's increased understanding, his empathy for the point of view that the Judaizers had. You know, when you are in some kind of dispute with someone, it's always helpful to try to walk in their shoes, you know, and to understand their perspective and to recognize what it is that motivates them. I'm thinking that as Paul wrote the letter, I think he must have, as his anger abated, I think he must have taken this into consideration. Hence, it helps account for the different tone that he takes. You know, at one point in the text, I can't remember what verse it is. It's towards the conclusion of our reading today. At one point, my goodness, he refers to, now keep in mind, what did he say to these people? You foolish Galatian idiots, you know, who is it that has cast a spell upon you? I mean, the same Paul, who's been very angry towards these readers, he calls them my children. Wouldn't you say that he's changed his tone just a little bit? Now, the Apostle John used that terminology all the time, but John had gotten to the ripe old age that everybody was young enough to be his children, you know, and he was this saintly old father figure. But I think there was something else happening in the text here too, because Paul moves on to reflect upon his specific experience in the region of Galatia. Remember that we're not talking about necessarily about a single particular church. We're talking about maybe a cluster of Christians who were in various communities. Maybe there were churches established in those communities, but Paul looks back and he reflects upon the time that he spent with them, and he remembers the people's tender, patient response to his needs when he was sick. Now, we find this out also in the Acts account that speaks of his missionary journey. Paul said, "You were so good to me when I was there ill." And he acknowledges that he was something of a pain for them in terms of taking care of him. He said it was a trial for you. And we don't know exactly what was wrong with Paul. There's speculation. You know, the fact that he refers to his eyes and that kind of thing, and then, later on talks about the large letters that he's writing and such. Some people believe that he had some kind of serious eye problem. Other scholars say that no, Paul was probably suffering from malaria, because in the Acts text, he had been in an area that was soupy and swampy and covered over with mosquitoes and all other kinds of insects, and he could very easily have had malaria, but he was a little bit of a pain for them. At least that's how he says it. But he says they went out of their way for him, willing to give them their own eyes. And some interpreters see that as a kind of idiom where, for example, someone says, "You know what? They would have been willing to give you their right arm, to help." This may have been such an idiom, but suffice it to say that they were willing to help. Some people go so far as to say that Paul actually established the church at Galatia from his sick bed. Now, that's quite a statement. Just imagine the good he could have done had he been well. But the point that Paul is making here is that he had a deep heart connection with these people. But that heart connection had been damaged by some who had come in with a different gospel, some people who were there to undo whatever good he had done, and they did so with flattery and praise for others. And Paul says that it was tantamount to driving a wedge between you and me. See, it wasn't just a matter of theology. They also, these Judaizers, they also trashed Paul's reputation. It's almost as though Paul, at this point in the letter, is reaching out and putting his arm around these folks and saying, "Come on, people. You know me, and I know you. Let's make this thing right." There have been times in my ministry where, especially at the denominational level, where we were having to deal with some very difficult issue. And I had a very good friend who was pastor of the Bronx Baptist Church in the Bronx, New York. Sam Simpson was his name. He was a native of Jamaica, a very passionate kind of guy. And I remember, and we had known each other a long time, and we took a restroom break. We were dealing with a personnel issue and some other things, related to some staff issues. And I remember walking out of the restroom, and he said to me, "My God, this has got to stop." He was talking about the arguing and the going back and forth. And I remember that he did so in such a way that it was a kind of, it communicated to me, and my response to him communicated to him that, we've been friends for a long time. We know each other well. We know each other's heart. Surely we can come to a conclusion where we're not just beating on and battering one another. It was a come let us reason kind of moment. And maybe you've had family arguments or arguments in some other setting where for a while you deal with issues and it stirs up passion and anger, and maybe you get a little bit red-faced, but then you come to the point where you realize, you know what? Neither one of us is making any progress. Why can't I just have the humility to say, you know what? I love you, and I believe you love me, and we care about each other. Let's see if we can think through things in a more calm and caring and rational kind of way. And so I see Paul doing that here. Now, that said, Paul's not completely finished being mad. What he does is he starts writing and he gets himself in a stir. It's like, dadgummit, and he just, he growls again. But then he thinks, no, let's let the good angels prevail, and let's continue. Now, there's a couple of pretty simple and straightforward lessons that we can derive from the passage this morning that I would like to suggest to you. I think there's a real lesson here in Christian maturity, especially in the life of the church. We need, as believers, to be careful that we don't ever allow disputed issues in church life spoil or even destroy relationships that have developed over a long time. Relationships with people who, when we were sick or sorrowful, people who prayed for us. And when they were having trouble, we prayed for them because we love them as a brother or a sister in Christ. We need to be very careful that we don't come to that point to where disputed issues in church life can prove to be divisive to the extent of damaging the bond that we have for other people. Now, granted, I'll fully grant it, this was no small issue, the whole Judaizer thing. It was not a small issue, but most issues in church life that I've dealt with over a long, long time, they have been over things that were far, far less critical than anything that we're talking about here in the Galatian letter. Fussing about who's going to be in charge without saying so, It happens a lot. There were some people in the church that I used to serve, I'll be careful what I say since this is recorded. But I was the one thing that stood in their way from their being in charge. I was the one obstacle. And I can dig my heels in pretty deep as well. And but it's usually about that. It's usually about the direction of the church, or it's about choice in staff, or sometimes it can be as menial as the color of drapes, or what kind of chairs we're going to have, or what we're going to spend significant amounts of money on. It's usually that kind of stuff. And my, sometimes it is important that we trust leadership that has been put in place. We believe by God, because we don't call anybody to leadership hopefully without it being a matter of prayer and thoughtful consideration. But we need to trust leadership, especially when we know leaders to be sincere people of integrity, whose goal for you and for everyone else in the church is that Christ be formed in you, that you come to faith, and once you come to faith, that you grow in faith and in Christian service. Paul, his yearning and his longing for the people of Galatia was to the point, in his words, to having become painful as birth pains. Now, I'm not sure how he knew that. Maybe he had heard women hollering and screaming and carrying on, having babies, and I always wonder if it's really that painful. I shouldn't say that. That's a sexist kind of thing, because it's not an easy thing for you moms. I know that. I understand that. Laura and I went through these. What were those classes called? What? Lamaze. Anybody remember that terminology? Lamaze classes. That's where you learn to breathe, and the husband is supposed to be the breathing coach, there. Boy, Laura just wanted me to get out of the way. Just move, get out of here, Okay, that's fine with me. But, it is a harrowing process. Well, Paul says he has begun to feel that kind of pain for these people. That's how committed he is for them to truly know Christ and to grow in Christ. We could say more about that. But good pastors, Sunday school teachers, deacons, fellow brothers and sisters in Christ who want the church to be what it ought to be all of our passion to see people come to faith in Christ and come to learn about Christian service and to grow in discipleship. Now, the last thing that I want you to notice here in the time that we have, and we're going to wrap up here in a minute, I want you to look at verse 19. And this is another one that I underlined for personal reasons, but I really like it a lot. It is always good to be pursued in a good manner. Now, he's just talked about how these Judaizers were pursuing people with flattery and false praise and all of this. But Paul thinks of himself as being good in his pursuit of these people. I underline this, I think, because all of my ministerial life, I've tried never to give up on people who needed a little nudging, who needed a little encouragement in their Christian walk. And I tried over the years to be aware of the hand that we were playing with as a church, and to think in terms of people's potential for growth and to try to plug them into positions that might be a little bit challenging for them, but that had the prospect of growth for them. And I think Paul is saying that it's okay to stay after folks sometimes. And I used to do it a lot more than I do now. People would stay on our outreach list for years. And especially if I knew that they were just coming out of a non-church background or for some other reason, I believed that they needed to find Christ, because I always wanted to have an opportunity for them to be under the sound of preaching and teaching that might help them. And so I sent cards, I made phone calls. When I did see them, I made every effort to make sure that they felt welcome. And, I never wanted to be a nuisance, but neither did I want to give up on people. And for those of you who are in the position of pursuers with somebody, that maybe you teach a class and you've seen some things in people and you really have your eye on them as having great potential for spiritual growth and service. To those who are in the position of being pursuers, then be encouraged by this text. Paul says it's a good thing to pursue. What does he say? He says it is always good to be pursued in a good manner. He was saying, you Galatians, please don't get tired of me, because I am pursuing you in the interest that I believe that is in your best interest. And to those who are pursuees, and there may be some of them listening to me this morning, to those who are pursuees, I hope that you recognize that a Bible study leader, a youth leader, a lay leader, or a friend is pursuing you out of love and care for your soul. And I had a psychologist friend one time. I was having a conversation with him, and he was telling me about this person that he had been counseling. He wasn't sharing a name or anything like that, but he was, he had gotten frustrated with, she didn't seem to be making any progress. And over lunch, I asked him, I said, well, what are you going to do? He said real simply, I'm going to drop her as a client, and then I thought, gosh, I can't do that. I just, my calling is a little bit different. We have to, in our witness and in our sharing the faith and in our encouraging people spiritually, we have to stay out after them. Like we have to continue to pray for them and to encourage them and to reach out to them in every way that we can. That might be a family member. It might be a friend. It might be somebody who has just fallen away from involvement in the life of the church. It may be somebody who needs to find Christ, whatever the case might be. So there's a couple of just real simple truths here this morning that I hope you'll take away from this really interesting text. Let's bow our heads together.